In the dying days of April 1945, as Berlin crumbled under the relentless advance of Allied forces, a desperate race was unfolding beneath the gray waters of the Baltic Sea. German U-boat crews, their faces hollow from years of grueling undersea warfare, were receiving orders that went against every instinct they had developed as submariners. Destroy your vessels. Scuttle everything. Leave nothing for the enemy. Captain Heinrich Lehmann stood on the bridge of his Type 21 submarine, watching the gray dawn break over the harbor at Kiel. Around him, the sounds of a collapsing Reich filled the air. Distant artillery thunder mixed with the closer sounds of demolition charges as German forces destroyed what they could not evacuate. The smell of smoke hung heavy over the water, mixing with the familiar diesel and salt that had been his constant companions for 4 years of undersea warfare. In his hand, Lehmann held the order that had arrived just hours before. Destroy all vessels. Prevent capture by enemy forces. It was written in the clipped, formal language of the Kriegsmarine, but its meaning was clear enough. Everything he had fought for, everything he had survived, was to end in self-destruction. But in the chaos of a collapsing Reich, not every order was followed. And in those precious hours between surrender and destruction, the fate of submarine warfare for the next half-century would be decided. The Soviet Union in 1952 faced a problem that seemed almost insurmountable. While the Americans were already laying the groundwork for nuclear-powered submarines that could remain submerged for months, the Soviets possessed no such technology. Their nuclear program was focused entirely on weapons, on matching the American atomic bomb that had ended the war in the Pacific. Submarine reactors were a distant dream, years away from practical application. But Joseph Stalin, ever paranoid about the vulnerability of the Soviet coastline, demanded a modern submarine fleet. The vast expanse of Soviet territorial waters, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Black Sea, represented both an asset and a liability. Those waters could shield the Soviet heartland from naval attack, but only if they were defended by capable submarines. The solution, as it turned out, had been captured 7 years earlier in the muddy shipyards of a defeated Germany. If you're finding this journey through Cold War history fascinating, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Your support helps bring more untold stories from this incredible era to light. The history we're about to explore changed the balance of naval power for decades and shaped confrontations that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The story of how the Soviet Union built its submarine fleet from the wreckage of Nazi Germany begins not in Moscow, but in the industrial city of Kiel, where the most advanced submarines ever constructed were waiting in their pens for a war that had already been lost. The German type. 21 submarine represented a quantum leap in underwater warfare. Before its development, submarines were essentially surface vessels that could temporarily submerge. They spent most of their operational time on the surface, diving only to attack or evade. Their underwater speed was painfully slow, their battery capacity limited, and their need to surface regularly for air made them vulnerable to increasingly sophisticated Allied detection methods. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany. Allied aircraft equipped with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors were finding and destroying U-boats at an unsustainable rate. The Wolfpack tactics that had once terrorized Allied shipping were now death sentences for the submarines that attempted them. Something radical was needed to restore the submarine threat. The Type 21 changed everything. Its streamlined hull, designed purely for underwater performance rather than surface sailing, could achieve an unprecedented 17 knots while submerged. Previous submarines could manage perhaps 8 knots underwater before their batteries were exhausted. The Type 21 nearly doubled that speed, making it faster submerged than many surface escorts. Its massive battery banks, 3 times the capacity of previous designs, allowed extended underwater operations. Where older submarines might stay submerged for 12 hours at minimal speed, the Type 21 could remain underwater for days, moving at speeds that let it keep pace with convoys while staying safely beneath the surface. Its snorkel system meant it could run its diesel engines while remaining just below the surface, recharging batteries without fully exposing itself to enemy aircraft. This seemingly simple innovation transformed submarine operations. Previously, a submarine had to surface completely to run its diesels, exposing its hull, conning tower, and deck to observation and attack. The snorkel reduced this exposure to a small pipe barely visible above the waves. German engineers had created the first true submarine, a vessel designed to operate primarily beneath the waves rather than on top of them. Had the Type 21 entered service in significant numbers earlier in the war, the Battle of the Atlantic might have taken a very different course. Allied admirals who examined captured Type 21s after the war were unanimous in their assessment. Had these boats been available in numbers even a year earlier, the convoy system might have collapsed under renewed U-boat attacks. But the war ended before Germany could deploy its revolutionary boats in meaningful numbers. Of the 118 Type 21 submarines completed, only 2 ever conducted war patrols. The rest sat in their pens or lay on assembly lines in various stages of completion when Allied forces arrived. Production of the type. 21 had been plagued by the same problems that affected all German industry in the final years of the war. Allied bombing disrupted supply lines and destroyed factories. Skilled workers were drafted into the armed forces and replaced by slave labor whose productivity and quality control were inevitably lower. Components that should have fit together perfectly required extensive hand-fitting because tolerances had slipped. The modular construction system that German engineers had developed to speed production had its own problems. The Type 21 was built in 8 sections at inland factories, then transported to shipyards for final assembly. This distributed construction reduced vulnerability to bombing, but created enormous logistical challenges. Sections sometimes arrived at assembly yards with misaligned fittings, requiring weeks of adjustment before they could be joined. What happened after the German surrender was a scramble that rivaled any military operation of the war. American, British, and Soviet intelligence services had long known about German advances in submarine technology. Each nation was determined to capture as much of this technology as possible, along with the engineers who had created it. The Americans secured several Type 21 boats and immediately shipped them back to the United States for study. The USS Nautilus nuclear submarine, commissioned 9 years later, would incorporate lessons learned from those captured German boats. The British did the same, their post-war submarine designs showing clear German influence. But the Soviets, whose forces had overrun the eastern German shipyards, found themselves in possession of an even greater prize. The speed of the Soviet advance in the final weeks of the war caught even German forces by surprise. Units that had expected to have days to carry out demolition orders found Soviet tanks appearing in hours. In the shipyards of Danzig, now returned to its Polish name of Gdansk, Soviet naval officers discovered not just completed submarines, but something far more valuable. They found the blueprints, the production equipment, and most importantly, the engineers and technicians who understood how these revolutionary vessels worked. The scene in those shipyards in May of 1945 was one of controlled chaos. Soviet naval intelligence officers, many of whom had spent the war analyzing captured German documents and equipment, moved through the facilities with lists of priority items. Every piece of technical documentation was photographed and cataloged. Every piece of specialized machinery was marked for shipment east. Captain Alexei Petrov of Soviet Naval Intelligence arrived in Gdansk just 3 days after the German surrender. His orders were specific: secure all submarine-related documentation and identify German personnel with knowledge of advanced submarine systems. He had studied German U-boat operations throughout the war, analyzing patrol reports captured from sunken submarines and intelligence gathered from interrogated prisoners. Nothing had prepared him for what he found in the German shipyards. Walking through the partially completed hull of a Type 21, Petrov recalled his first encounter with this remarkable vessel. The hull shape was unlike anything in the Soviet fleet. Where Soviet submarines had deck guns and conning towers designed for surface combat, the German boat was smooth, hydrodynamic, built for one purpose only: to be the most efficient underwater vessel possible. The internal arrangement was equally revolutionary. The torpedo reload system allowed the crew to fire and reload all 6 bow tubes in just 15 minutes, compared to over an hour for conventional submarines. The automatic depth-keeping system maintained perfect trim without constant attention from the crew. The 3-deck arrangement maximized use of the available space while keeping the center of gravity low for stability. Petrov spent hours in that incomplete submarine, making notes, taking photographs, trying to understand not just what the Germans had built, but why they had made each design decision. This questioning attitude would prove essential in the years ahead, when Soviet engineers worked to adapt German innovations to Soviet production methods. Among the Soviet officers coordinating this effort was a young naval engineer named Sergei Kovalev. He would later become one of the most important figures in Soviet submarine design, eventually heading the design bureau responsible for the Soviet nuclear submarine fleet. But in those spring days of '45, he was simply trying to make sense of what the Germans had achieved. Kovalev later recalled being struck by how different the Type 21 was from anything he had studied in Soviet naval engineering schools. Soviet submarine design philosophy, inherited from pre-revolutionary Russia and modified through the interwar years, emphasized surface capability. Soviet submarines were expected to operate on the surface most of the time, diving only when threatened or attacking. The German Type 21 inverted this entire concept. Its hull was designed exclusively for underwater performance. The boat was awkward and slow on the surface, its streamlined shape creating poor seakeeping in waves. But beneath the waves, it moved with a grace and speed that made every other submarine in the world obsolete overnight. Understanding this philosophical shift was perhaps even more important than understanding the technical details. Soviet naval planners had to reconceptualize what a submarine was for and how it would fight in any future conflict. The Soviet team spent weeks documenting every aspect of the German designs. They photographed welds and measured tolerances. They recorded the specifications of every valve, every pump, every electrical system. They interviewed German technicians, some willingly and others under considerably more pressure, extracting every piece of knowledge about how these boats were built and operated. One German engineer, Ernst Weber, spent 3 weeks explaining the battery system to Soviet specialists. The Type 21's batteries represented a significant advance over previous designs, not just in capacity, but in safety and maintainability. Weber described the ventilation systems that prevented dangerous hydrogen accumulation, the monitoring circuits that detected weak cells before they could cause problems, the charging procedures that maximized battery life. His Soviet counterparts asked questions that forced him to articulate knowledge he had taken for granted. Why was this particular alloy used for the cell cases? What problems had they encountered with earlier designs? How did temperature affect charging rates? Weber found himself explaining not just what the Germans had built, but the entire reasoning process that had led to those solutions. The immediate post-war years were a time of intense study and analysis. Soviet engineers pored over captured German documentation, conducted extensive tests on captured boats, and began the laborious process of translating German innovation into Soviet production capability. This was not simply a matter of copying blueprints. Soviet industry had different capabilities and different limitations than German industry. Steel alloys that German yards produced routinely were not available in the Soviet Union. Electrical components that German manufacturers had perfected required adaptation to Soviet standards and production methods. The specialized welding techniques that German shipyards had developed for high-strength pressure hulls were particularly challenging to replicate. German welders had years of experience with these techniques, backed by sophisticated quality control systems and extensive training programs. Soviet industry had to develop equivalent capabilities, essentially from scratch. Material science presented another challenge. The high-strength steels used in Type 21 pressure hulls allowed the boats to dive deeper than previous designs. Soviet metallurgical industry could produce similar alloys, but quality control was less consistent. Every batch of steel had to be tested extensively to ensure it met the demanding specifications required for submarine construction. The first Soviet submarine to incorporate lessons from the German designs was the Project 613, known in the West as the Whiskey class. Work on the design began in 1946, just a year after the war ended, with the first boats laid down in 1950. The design team was led by Vladimir Peregudov, a veteran submarine designer who had worked on Soviet submarines throughout the interwar period and the war years. Peregudov approached the German technology with a combination of respect and critical analysis. He recognized the revolutionary nature of German innovations, while also identifying areas where Soviet requirements differed from German priorities. The Whiskey class was not a direct copy of the Type 21. Soviet designers had studied the German boats carefully and identified what they considered the essential innovations while adapting others to Soviet requirements and capabilities. The result was a medium-sized submarine that incorporated the German streamlined hull form and enhanced battery capacity, but added features that Soviet naval doctrine demanded. The design process was marked by intense debates within the Soviet naval establishment. Conservative officers wanted to retain traditional features like deck guns, arguing that submarines might need to engage surface targets without expending torpedoes. They pointed to situations during the war when Soviet submarines had used their guns effectively against German coastal shipping. Progressive engineers, inspired by what they had seen in German designs, argued that the future belonged to submarines that prioritized underwater performance above all else. Deck guns created drag that reduced underwater speed. The personnel and ammunition required for gun operations took space and weight that could be used for additional torpedoes or batteries. Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, commander of the Soviet Navy, ultimately sided with the progressives. The Whiskey class would be designed primarily for underwater operations, though some early boats retained limited surface armament. This decision represented a fundamental shift in Soviet submarine doctrine, one that traced directly to the influence of captured German technology. In the end, a compromise emerged. Early Whiskey-class boats retained some surface-oriented features, but the basic hull design clearly showed its German ancestry. The streamlined shape, the enclosed bridge, the emphasis on underwater speed and endurance, all traced directly back to the Type 21. Production of the Whiskey class began in earnest in 1951. The Soviet Union's massive industrial capacity, still organized along wartime lines, was turned to submarine construction, with a determination that surprised Western intelligence analysts. Shipyards across the country were retooled for submarine production. Workers were trained in techniques derived from German methods. Quality control systems were implemented based on captured German documentation. The Gorky shipyard on the Volga River became a center of whiskey-class production. Located deep in the Soviet interior, far from any potential enemy attack, Gorky had produced river vessels and small combatants during the war. Converting it to submarine construction required enormous investment in new facilities, training programs, and supply chains. Thousands of workers were trained in submarine construction techniques. Many had never seen a submarine before arriving at the shipyard. They learned welding techniques, electrical installation, propulsion system assembly, and the dozens of other specialized skills required to build these complex vessels. The scale of the program was staggering. Over the next decade, Soviet shipyards would produce over 200 Whiskey-class submarines, making it one of the most numerous submarine classes in history. This massive production run served multiple purposes beyond simply building a fleet. First, it allowed Soviet industry to develop the skills and infrastructure necessary for modern submarine construction. Workers, who started their careers building Whiskey-class boats, would go on to construct the nuclear submarines that would challenge American naval supremacy during the Cold War. The techniques they learned, the quality standards they mastered, formed the foundation for decades of subsequent development. Second, it provided the Soviet Navy with practical experience in operating modern submarines. Crews trained on Whiskey-class boats learned techniques and developed doctrines that would prove essential as the submarine force evolved. The hundreds of officers who commanded Whiskey-class boats formed the leadership cadre for the nuclear submarine fleet that followed. Third, and perhaps most importantly from Stalin's perspective, it gave the Soviet Union a credible submarine capability at a time when the country remained vulnerable to American naval power. The Whiskey-class boats might not have been able to challenge the American surface fleet directly, but they represented a threat that American naval planners could not ignore. American intelligence tracked Soviet submarine production with growing alarm. The sheer numbers of boats emerging from Soviet shipyards exceeded pre-war projections significantly. Each new Whiskey-class submarine represented a potential threat to American shipping, to naval operations, to the lines of communication that connected America to its allies in Europe and Asia. While the Whiskey-class was entering production, Soviet designers were already working on larger, more capable submarines that pushed German concepts even further. Project 611, the Zulu class, was designed as a larger ocean-going boat capable of extended patrols far from Soviet waters. The Zulu class incorporated everything Soviet engineers had learned from the German Type 21, scaled up for greater range and capability. Its hull was longer and more refined, its battery capacity greater, its torpedo armament more substantial. Where the Whiskey class was designed for coastal and regional operations, the Zulu class was built for the open ocean. The Zulu represented the logical evolution of German concepts, adapted and enhanced for Soviet requirements. Its design team spent years refining the hull form, testing models in towing tanks and analyzing the results with increasingly sophisticated mathematical techniques. The goal was to squeeze every possible fraction of a knot from the streamlined shape, to maximize underwater performance while maintaining the structural integrity needed to survive combat operations. The propulsion system was equally refined. Soviet engineers had developed improved diesel engines that offered better power-to-weight ratios than the German originals. The electric motors that drove the submarine underwater incorporated lessons learned from years of analyzing captured German equipment. Every component was optimized for the demanding requirements of extended underwater operations. But even as these diesel-electric submarines were entering service, Soviet naval planners understood that they represented a transitional technology. The future belonged to nuclear power, and the race to develop nuclear submarines would dominate Soviet naval thinking throughout the 1950s. The American Navy commissioned the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, in September 1954. This single vessel made every diesel-electric submarine in the world obsolete overnight. Nuclear power meant unlimited underwater endurance, limited only by food supplies and crew fatigue. Nuclear submarines could circumnavigate the globe without surfacing. They could operate beneath the polar ice cap, opening entirely new dimensions of submarine warfare. The implications for naval strategy were profound. A nuclear submarine could shadow an enemy fleet indefinitely, waiting for the optimal moment to attack. It could patrol across vast ocean areas, moving faster and farther than any diesel-electric boat. It could strike without warning and disappear into the depths before any response was possible. Soviet engineers had begun work on nuclear submarine propulsion even before Nautilus entered service, but they faced enormous challenges. The Soviet nuclear program was focused almost exclusively on weapons development. The expertise in reactor design, the specialized materials, the safety systems required for shipboard nuclear reactors, all had to be developed essentially from scratch. The pressure to match American capabilities was intense. Stalin had died in 1953, but his successors were equally determined to challenge American naval power. Nikita Khrushchev, who consolidated power by 1955, made submarine development a national priority. He understood that submarines offered the Soviet Union a way to challenge American naval dominance without matching the American surface fleet ship for ship. The first Soviet nuclear submarine, designated Project 627 and known in the West as the November class, was laid down in 1955. Like the diesel-electric boats before it, the November class drew heavily on German concepts, though adapted for nuclear propulsion. The streamlined hull form that German engineers had pioneered remained the basis for underwater performance, now powered by twin nuclear reactors rather than diesel engines and batteries. But the path to the November class was paved by the captured German technology and the experience gained building hundreds of conventional submarines. The Whiskey-class boats, the Zulu-class, and other designs derived from German concepts had given Soviet industry the skills and Soviet crews the experience necessary to operate an advanced submarine fleet. The engineers who designed the November class had cut their teeth on German-derived conventional submarines. The workers who built its hull had learned their welding techniques constructing Whiskey-class boats. The officers who commanded the first nuclear submarines had gained their experience on diesel-electric boats whose designs traced back to German wartime innovations. The story of how this technology transfer occurred is itself a fascinating chapter in Cold War history. The operation to capture and transport German submarine technology was among the most extensive scientific intelligence operations of the immediate post-war period. In the weeks following German surrender, teams of Soviet specialists fanned out across the occupied zone, each with specific targets to locate and secure. One team sought submarine hull construction specialists, another targeted torpedo experts. A third focused on diesel engine technology, while a fourth concentrated on electrical systems and battery technology. The coordination of these teams was handled by the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet Navy, which had spent the war years building an extensive database of German technical capabilities. Officers who had interrogated, captured German sailors, knew which engineers to look for. Analysts who had studied salvaged equipment could identify which factories had produced the most advanced components. The human dimension of this operation was complex and often troubling. Many German engineers cooperated willingly, seeing continued work in their field as preferable to the uncertain fate facing much of the German population. The chaos of post-war Germany offered few attractive alternatives. Working for the Soviets at least provided food, shelter, and the opportunity to continue practicing their profession. Others were given little choice, effectively conscripted into Soviet service. The line between voluntary cooperation and coercion was often blurred. German specialists might agree to work for the Soviets while understanding that refusal would have unpleasant consequences. A significant number of German submarine specialists were transported to the Soviet Union, where they worked alongside Soviet engineers in closed design bureaus. These Germans provided invaluable practical knowledge that supplemented the technical documentation captured in the shipyards. The working conditions for these German specialists varied considerably. Some were treated as valued colleagues, given comfortable housing and reasonable working conditions in special compounds established for foreign technical specialists. They received salaries, could write to their families in Germany, and enjoyed privileges unavailable to ordinary Soviet citizens. Others found themselves in circumstances little better than imprisonment, their expertise extracted through pressure rather than partnership. The distinction often depended on the perceived value of their knowledge and the personalities of the Soviet officials managing their work. Regardless of how they were treated, these German engineers played a crucial role in accelerating Soviet submarine development. They could explain not just what the German designs achieved, but why certain decisions had been made, what alternatives had been considered and rejected, and what problems had been encountered during development and production. Hans Richter, a senior engineer from the Blohm und Voss shipyard in Hamburg, spent 6 years in a Soviet design bureau near Leningrad. His specialty was pressure hull construction, the critical technology that determined how deep a submarine could dive. Richter had helped develop the advanced welding techniques that allowed Type 21 boats to operate at unprecedented depths. In the Soviet Union, Richter found himself teaching classes to Soviet engineers, explaining techniques that had taken German industry years to develop. He demonstrated welding procedures, analyzed test results, and helped troubleshoot problems that arose during early Whiskey-class construction. His Soviet students were eager learners, asking detailed questions and working long hours to master the skills he taught. Richter later described his Soviet colleagues as brilliant engineers hampered by an industrial system that made innovation difficult. They understood theoretical concepts quickly, often seeing implications that Richter had missed, but translating theory into practice required resources, equipment, and organizational flexibility that the Soviet system struggled to provide. One German engineer who spent several years in Soviet design bureaus later recalled the intense curiosity of his Soviet colleagues. They wanted to understand everything, not just the final specifications, but the entire reasoning process that had led to those specifications. They asked questions that forced him to articulate knowledge he had taken for granted, to explain decisions that had seemed obvious in the German context. This deep engagement with German expertise accelerated Soviet understanding considerably. Rather than simply reverse engineering captured equipment, Soviet designers could understand the principles behind German innovations and adapt them more effectively to Soviet circumstances. The influence of German submarine technology extended beyond hull design and propulsion systems. German advances in torpedo technology, fire control systems, and sonar equipment all found their way into Soviet submarines. The acoustic homing torpedoes that German U-boats had begun deploying late in the war became the basis for Soviet torpedo development programs. German snorkel technology was particularly important. The snorkel, essentially a breathing tube that allowed a submarine to run its diesel engines while remaining just below the surface, had been a crucial German innovation that extended submarine endurance and reduced vulnerability to air attack. The physics behind the snorkel were straightforward, but the engineering challenges were substantial. The snorkel had to be strong enough to withstand wave action, yet light enough not to affect the submarine's balance. Its head valve had to close instantly when submerged to prevent flooding, yet open reliably when raised. The exhaust system had to be designed to minimize the visible and radar signatures of the snorkel in use. Soviet engineers refined and improved upon German snorkel designs, developing systems that were more reliable and harder to detect. The snorkel-equipped Whiskey-class submarines could operate far from Soviet bases, extending the reach of Soviet naval power even before nuclear submarines entered service. These conventional submarines conducted operations throughout the world's oceans, gathering intelligence, tracking Western naval forces, and demonstrating Soviet capability to project power far from home waters. Their snorkel systems allowed them to cross ocean areas that would have been impossible for non-snorkel boats, remaining submerged during daylight hours and surfacing only briefly at night. The fire control systems on German submarines represented another significant advance. German engineers had developed mechanical computers that could calculate torpedo firing solutions automatically, accounting for target speed, course, and range. These systems were far more sophisticated than anything in the Soviet arsenal. Capturing and understanding these fire control systems was a priority for Soviet intelligence. The mechanical complexity of these devices made them difficult to copy directly, but the principles they embodied, the mathematical relationships they calculated, could be studied and implemented in Soviet designs. By the early 1950s, Soviet submarines were equipped with fire control systems that owed much to German innovations, though adapted and simplified for Soviet production capabilities. These systems would continue to evolve, eventually incorporating electronic computers, but their conceptual foundation traced back to captured German technology. The broader impact of German submarine technology on Soviet naval development cannot be overstated. The decision to base Soviet submarine design on German concepts shaped not just individual boats, but the entire Soviet approach to underwater warfare. Soviet submarines of the Cold War era shared certain characteristics that traced back to the German Type 21, emphasis on underwater speed and endurance, streamlined hull forms, sophisticated battery and electrical systems. Even the nuclear submarines that eventually gave the Soviet Union parity with American naval power incorporated design principles that had originated in German wartime research. Soviet submarine designers themselves acknowledged this debt, though usually in internal documents rather than public statements. The official Soviet narrative emphasized indigenous innovation and the superiority of socialist engineering, but those who actually worked on submarine design understood how much they owed to captured German technology. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who commanded the Soviet Navy from 1956 to 1985, spoke privately about the German contribution to Soviet submarine development. In conversations with fellow officers, he acknowledged that the Type 21 had provided a foundation that accelerated Soviet progress by years. Without access to German technology and expertise, he suggested, the Soviet submarine force might not have reached parity with American capabilities until well into the 1960s. One Soviet admiral, writing his memoirs decades later, reflected on this period with unusual candor. He noted that the German submarines captured at the end of the war represented a gift that accelerated Soviet naval development by perhaps a decade. The technology was sophisticated, the documentation comprehensive, and the German specialists who helped explain it all were invaluable resources. This acceleration had profound implications for Cold War history. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, often considered the closest the world came to nuclear war, involved Soviet submarines that owed their capabilities in part to German designs. 4 Soviet diesel-electric submarines, belonging to the Foxtrot class that had evolved from the earlier German-derived designs, accompanied the Soviet merchant ships carrying missiles to Cuba. The underwater confrontation between American and Soviet submarines during that crisis demonstrated how effectively Soviet designers had adapted German concepts. American destroyers spent days hunting these Soviet submarines, using their most advanced detection equipment. The Soviet boats, employing techniques and capabilities derived ultimately from German innovations, proved far more difficult to locate and track than American planners had expected. One of these submarines, B-59, came dangerously close to launching a nuclear-armed torpedo during the crisis. Its captain, exhausted from days of being hunted and cut off from communication with Moscow, considered this final option when American depth charges exploded nearby. Only the intervention of another officer on board prevented a launch that might have triggered nuclear war. The broader lesson of this technological transfer extends beyond the specific case of submarines. The German innovations in submarine technology were themselves the product of wartime pressure and creative engineering. German designers, working under the extreme constraints of a losing war, produced revolutionary solutions that changed underwater warfare forever. The ability of Soviet engineers to capture, understand, and adapt these innovations demonstrated another kind of capability, the capacity to absorb foreign technology and integrate it with domestic expertise. This pattern would repeat throughout the Cold War as both superpowers sought to learn from each other's advances. The submarine story also illustrates the complex relationship between military defeat and technological legacy. Germany lost the Second World War utterly and completely, but German innovations lived on in the submarine fleets of both superpowers. The engineers who created the Type 21 might have preferred that their work served German interests, but their innovations ultimately benefited nations that had been Germany's enemies. This transfer of technology across ideological and national boundaries challenges simple narratives about the Cold War. The competition between capitalism and communism, between the American and Soviet systems, was often portrayed as a contest between fundamentally different approaches to technology and innovation. But beneath this ideological surface, both sides drew on common sources of knowledge and expertise. The German engineers who worked in Soviet design bureaus and their counterparts who aided American submarine development represented a transnational technical community that transcended political boundaries. Their expertise was valuable regardless of the flag under which they worked. The physical artifacts of this technology transfer can still be seen today. A few Whiskey-class submarines survive as museum ships, their German-derived hull forms still evident after decades of service. Technical drawings from the post-war period show the clear lineage from Type 21 to Soviet designs. The institutional memory of Soviet submarine design bureaus, now Russian, includes an awareness of this historical debt. The strategic implications of Soviet submarine development based on German technology shaped the entire Cold War naval competition. American naval planners had to account for a Soviet submarine force that was larger and more capable than they had expected. This Soviet threat drove American investments in anti-submarine warfare, in submarine detection technology, and in naval aviation designed to counter the submarine menace. The sound surveillance system, known as SOSUS, was developed specifically to track Soviet submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific. This network of underwater hydrophones, stretching across strategic choke points, could detect submarine sounds at ranges of hundreds of miles. Its development consumed enormous resources and required technological innovations that themselves advanced the field of acoustics. American anti-submarine aircraft, from the P-2 Neptune to the P-3 Orion, were designed and produced in large numbers specifically to counter the Soviet submarine threat. These aircraft carried sophisticated detection equipment and weapons designed to find and destroy submarines operating in waters far from American shores. The underwater Cold War that developed from the 1950s onward was shaped by decisions made in the chaotic final days of World War II. The race to capture German technology, the success of Soviet intelligence in securing submarine secrets, and the effectiveness of Soviet industry in translating those secrets into operational boats all contributed to a naval competition that lasted 4 decades. Understanding this history provides context for contemporary submarine development as well. The same patterns of technology transfer, adaptation, and improvement that characterized the post-war period continue today. Nations still seek to acquire advanced technology from wherever they can find it, still work to understand and improve upon foreign designs, still compete in underwater capabilities that trace their origins to that period of revolutionary innovation. The specific case of Soviet submarine development also offers lessons about the complexity of technological progress. Innovation rarely occurs in isolation. The German Type 21 represented not just German expertise, but incorporated lessons learned from Allied countermeasures, from the failures of earlier submarine campaigns, from international developments in materials, science, and electrical engineering. Similarly, Soviet submarines incorporated not just German technology, but Soviet innovations in metallurgy, in acoustic systems, in propulsion technology. The final product was neither purely German nor purely Soviet, but a synthesis that drew on multiple sources of knowledge and expertise. This synthesis was possible because Soviet engineers approached captured German technology not as something to be copied blindly, but as a foundation for further development. They asked not just how did the Germans do this, but how can we do it better? This questioning attitude, combined with access to German expertise, allowed Soviet submarine development to progress rapidly despite starting from a position of significant disadvantage. The personal stories of those involved in this technological transfer remind us that history is made by individuals as well as institutions. The young Soviet engineer walking through a captured German shipyard, the German specialist explaining design choices to Soviet colleagues, the factory workers learning new techniques for submarine construction, all contributed to an outcome that shaped the Cold War and continues to influence naval development today. Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov was 23 years old when he first descended into a Type 21 submarine in Gdansk harbor. He had spent the war years training on older Soviet submarines that seemed primitive compared to what he now saw. The German boat was cleaner, more logical in its arrangement, more obviously designed by people who understood what submariners needed. Sokolov spent the next 30 years in Soviet submarine service, eventually commanding a nuclear-powered boat in the 1970s. Throughout his career, he thought often about that first encounter with German submarine technology. The lessons he learned in those captured German boats shaped how he thought about underwater warfare for the rest of his life. Their stories deserve to be remembered not just for their historical significance, but for what they reveal about human adaptability and creativity. Faced with enormous challenges and working under intense pressure, these individuals found ways to transfer complex knowledge across linguistic and cultural barriers, to adapt sophisticated technology to new circumstances, and to create capabilities that their nations desperately needed. The submarines that resulted from this effort patrolled the world's oceans for decades, their crews unaware of or indifferent to the complex history that had produced their vessels. For these sailors, what mattered was that their boats worked, that they could dive deep and stay down, that they could threaten enemy ships and protect their homeland. The German origins of their submarines' design was a matter for historians, not for operational crews focused on the challenges of underwater warfare. Yet that history mattered enormously in shaping the Cold War naval balance. The decisions made in German shipyards during the war, the innovations that produced the Type 21, the failures that prevented earlier deployment, all influenced events decades later and thousands of miles away. The rivalry between Soviet and American submarine forces pushed both nations to develop ever more sophisticated underwater warfare capabilities. Soviet submarines grew quieter, faster, and more capable. American submarines matched these improvements, leading to an underwater arms race that consumed vast resources on both sides. This competition drove technological advances that extended far beyond military applications. Sonar technology developed for submarine detection found civilian uses in fishing, oil exploration, and marine science. Navigation systems created for submarines contributed to the development of satellite-based positioning. Materials science advances driven by the need for stronger, lighter submarine hulls benefited industries from aerospace to automotive. The story of Soviet submarine development based on captured German technology is ultimately a story about how knowledge moves across boundaries, how innovation in one context can transform capabilities in another, and how the consequences of technological decisions can extend far beyond their original intentions. German engineers designing the Type 21 could not have imagined that their work would help create a Soviet submarine fleet that challenged American naval power during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet planners capturing German shipyards could not have predicted how thoroughly German concepts would influence Soviet naval thinking for decades. American naval officers observing Soviet submarine development could not have known how much of what they saw derived from technology that American forces had also captured. These unintended consequences, these complex chains of cause and effect, are part of what makes this history so fascinating. The Cold War underwater competition that seemed so clearly divided between American and Soviet systems actually rested on a foundation of shared German technology, a common inheritance that both superpowers adapted to their own purposes. As we look back on this period from the perspective of the 21st century, with the Cold War itself now history, we can appreciate the irony and the complexity that characterized this era. The submarines that prowled beneath the waves, carrying enough destructive power to threaten civilization itself, traced their capabilities to innovations developed in a losing war by engineers who could not have imagined such consequences. The legacy of German submarine technology lives on in today's nuclear submarine fleets, though transformed beyond recognition by decades of subsequent innovation. The fundamental concepts, the emphasis on underwater performance, the streamlined hull forms, the integration of multiple systems into a cohesive undersea weapons platform, all originated in that desperate German effort to reverse the course of a losing war. That those innovations ultimately served the navies of Germany's conquerors rather than Germany itself is one of history's many ironies. Technology has no loyalty, no nationality in any meaningful sense. It serves whoever can understand it, whoever can build it, whoever can deploy it effectively. The German Type 21 served the Soviet Navy far more effectively than it ever served the Kriegsmarine. Captain Heinrich Lehmann, standing on his submarine's bridge in that gray dawn of April 1945, could not have imagined this outcome. His decision, whatever it was, contributed to a chain of events that shaped world history. Whether he scuttled his boat or not, whether Soviet forces captured his vessel or found only wreckage, his boat was part of a technological achievement that outlived the nation that created it. This story also reminds us that the Cold War, for all its ideological intensity, was fought with weapons and technologies that transcended ideology. Submarines designed by German engineers served both capitalist and communist navies. The competition between American and Soviet submarine forces was conducted using vessels that shared common technological ancestors. Perhaps there is comfort in this recognition that even in periods of intense conflict, human knowledge remains shared property in some fundamental sense. The innovations that make possible the most destructive weapons are the same innovations that drive peaceful progress. The skills that build submarines also build ships that carry cargo and passengers. The understanding of hydrodynamics that makes submarines fast also makes merchant vessels efficient. The captured German U-boat designs that enabled Soviet submarine development represent one example of how military technology flows across boundaries, influencing capabilities far from its point of origin. Similar stories could be told about aircraft, rockets, electronics, and countless other technologies that spread from defeated Germany to the victorious Allies. What made submarines special was their strategic significance in the emerging Cold War. Control of the seas had always been crucial to great power competition, and submarines represented a way for the Soviet Union to challenge American naval dominance without matching American surface ship construction. The German technology that enabled Soviet submarine development was therefore not just militarily significant, but strategically transformative. The underwater Cold War that followed, with American and Soviet submarines playing cat and mouse beneath the world's oceans, was made possible in part by those chaotic weeks in 1945, when Soviet intelligence secured German submarine secrets. The submariners who faced each other during decades of Cold War competition were working within a framework established by that initial technology transfer. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the complexity of technological development and the unpredictable consequences of innovation. The German engineers who created the Type 21 sought to save their country from defeat. Instead, their work enabled the naval power of one of Germany's greatest enemies. Such is the nature of technological progress, serving purposes its creators never intended. The story of the Soviet submarine program built on German designs is ultimately a human story about engineers and sailors, intelligence officers and factory workers, all contributing to an outcome that shaped world history. Their efforts, their frustrations, their occasional triumphs combined to produce a submarine force that helped define the Cold War era. That force is now mostly retired, its boats scrapped or converted to museums, its crews aged or passed away. But the history they made, the technology they developed and deployed, continues to influence submarine design and naval strategy today. The lineage from Type 21 to modern nuclear submarines, while transformed by decades of innovation, remains traceable. And so we remember this history, not just for its technical details, but for what it reveals about human creativity and adaptation, about the flow of knowledge across boundaries, and about the unintended consequences that make history so fascinating and so unpredictable. The Soviet Union may have had no submarine reactors in 1952, but it had something equally valuable: the wisdom to learn from captured German innovations and the determination to build upon them. The submarine force that resulted helped shape the Cold War and demonstrated that technological progress depends not just on original innovation, but on the ability to learn, adapt, and improve. That lesson remains relevant today, as nations continue to compete in technologies that will shape the future, just as submarine technology shaped the Cold War. The ghost of the German Type 21 lives on in every modern submarine, a reminder that innovation knows no borders and that the consequences of technological breakthroughs extend far beyond their original context. The waters of the Baltic Sea, where so much of this story began, remain strategically significant today. Modern submarines, descendants of those German designs, still patrol these waters. The technology has advanced beyond what those German engineers could have imagined, but the fundamental purpose remains the same: to project power beneath the waves, to threaten and deter, to protect and patrol. In the end, The story of Soviet submarine development based on captured German technology is a story about the persistence of human knowledge, about how ideas survive even the destruction of the nations that create them. The Type 21 was designed for a Reich that would last 1,000 years and built by a nation that collapsed in ruins. But the ideas it embodied, the innovations it represented, lived on to shape the naval balance of the Cold War and influence submarine design into the 21st century. That is the ultimate legacy of those German engineers, those Soviet intelligence officers, those workers in shipyards from Kiel to Gdansk to Gorky. They participated in a transfer of technology that changed the world, though few of them understood at the time what they were part of. Their story reminds us that history is made not just by the famous and powerful, but by countless individuals whose contributions, added together, produce outcomes that none of them could have predicted or controlled. The submarines they built and designed are mostly gone now, rusted into scrap or preserved in museums. But the knowledge they embodied, the capabilities they demonstrated, the strategic implications they created, all these remain part of our world, shaping naval competition and submarine development to this day. In that sense, the story of the German submarines that became Soviet submarines is not really over. It continues in every nuclear submarine that prowls beneath the world's oceans, carrying forward innovations that began in the desperate final months of a war that ended 8 decades ago.